In this tutorial, I will give an overview of data binding in ASP.NET Core. So basically, in this tutorial, we will see how we can get user data from the client side to the server side in ASP.NET Core. First, a short introduction, then I will go through different examples. First, we will use something called Request.Form. Then next, we will use something called Request.Query. And then finally, we will use the ASP.NET Core data binding functionality that is built into the ASP.NET Core framework. So let's start with an introduction. So in this tutorial, we will see how we can get user data from the client side to the server side using ASP.NET Core. And in general, web applications have a more complicated architecture, since we have both a server-side code and a client-side code. And this client-side code runs within a web browser, and the web browser can be from different vendors. We can have Chrome, Edge, Safari, etc. And this means this must be done in a different way compared to traditional Windows Forms desktop applications. So we will start with a traditional way that are used in many other web programming frameworks like PHP, etc. So also ASP.NET Core support those methods, and those methods are Request.Form and Request.Query. But later in this tutorial, we will also use the alternative data binding approach, which is part of the ASP.NET Core framework. So here you see a basic structure or architecture of a web page using ASP.NET Core. So we have the server-side part and the client-side part. And on the client-side part, we have the web browser, we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. that are running inside the web browser. And then on the server-side part, we have the ASP.NET Core framework using C# and Razor. And then typically also this is the server-side part is communicating with a database, and then the results from the server-side part are sent to the client. Let's start with the foundation for sending data from the client to the server, namely HTML forms. So the HTML form is an element that is used to create a form on the web page. And then HTML forms on the web page can allow a user to enter data that is sent to the server for processing. And an HTML form can contain text boxes, buttons, etc. And also this HTML form can have different attributes like method and action. And the method attribute decide the HTTP verb that are going to be used. Typically we have get and post that we are using in web pages. So in a basic HTML form we have this method which could be either post or get. And then inside the form, here's the form are starting here and ends here. Inside this form we can have different HTML objects like text boxes, buttons, etc. So here you see an example of a text box and a button. And then this HTML form is used to collect user input, and the user input is then often sent to the server for processing. And then on the server side in ASP.NET Core, you typically have the following event handler that are handling the response or the input from the client side. And then we have the event handler called OnGet and OnPost. So we will use those event handler further in this tutorial for handling the data that are sent to the client, to the server for further processing. Then let's start with the first example where we are going to use Request.Form. And so we will use the post and OnPost event handler. So here you see the application we are going to create in this example. It is a basic web application where we are going to create a a web form or an HTML form with two text boxes, one for name and one for email, and a button. And when we click on the OK button, these values should be sent to the server, and then this page should be sent back to the client, and then afterwards we have clicked OK and the data are sent to the server and back to the client. Then this information should be presented in the bottom of the web page to prove that the data that are written here in the name field and the email field are sent back to the server and then back to the client again. So let's start creating this basic application. So then I have opened my Visual Studio, and let's start creating a basic ASP.NET Core web application. So I just select create a new project, and you select ASP.NET Core web app project, click next, and then specify a location. So I have a folder here, I want to save it in a temporary folder, data binding. So let's select this folder and just enter a proper name for the application, and then you can just call it data binding example or something, and then just click next, and then this application will be created. So now we are ready to start creating our first web page. So here under pages we can store all our pages, and in the default template there are some pages that are already created, and then let's just use this startup page called index, which is consists of two pages. This index.cs HTML is the client side part, and this index.cs HTML.cs is the server side part. So then let's open the client side part and create an HTML form. So I just remove this default stuff and then just copy in a basic form. So here we have this basic form that are going to handle the input from the user, and then this information should be sent back to the server. And then we have a text box in HTML. A text box is an input field of type text, and here is the name, full name. And then you can have a label on top to make it easier for the user to see what kind of information that should be written in this text box. So this is a text box for entering the name, and then here we have a text box for entering the email address, and then here we have a button which the user can push on. And then since you have this method equal to post here in the form, then when the user click this OK button, this information will be sent back to the server for processing. So then basically this is the web page. Let's just open it and run it to see how this web page look like when you open it in the default web browser. So now the web page are opened in the default web browser. Like this. So then you have just here it says welcome. This is this H1 header, and then we have this text, please enter your information here, and then we have these two text boxes, one for name and one for email. So then you can type just a name here and an email and click OK. But so far nothing happens because we haven't created the server-side code for handling this information that are sent back to the server. So then we need to open the server-side part of this web page, namely index.cs html.cs. So just double-click on that one, and then we have some code here. We just delete all unnecessary code like this. So now we have the stuff we have left here is namely this public void OnGet, but since here in the web page we are using this post method, so then instead of OnGet we need to use OnPost like this. So inside this event handler called OnPost we will handle the information that are sent from the client to the server. And then we can start creating a couple of variables. String full name, since we have two text boxes, one for the full name or name and one for the email. Then string email like this. And then we can use this Request.Form, which I was mentioning. So then you can type full name equals to Request.Form. And then inside these brackets we just use and then here we need to enter the name that we are. So this is the input field for the full name, and it has the name, full name, so we need to use this name. So inside here we need to use full name and a semicolon like this, and then we need to use the same for the email. So then I just copy it, change it to email like this, and then the name here should be the name of the text box, which is email like this. And then we can use this view data to present the data back to the client from the server. So then I just type something like this, view data, and this here, since here I have used user data, I need to use the same here, user data equals, and then I can type something like this, user information plus, and then I can use, since now name that are written in the text box are put into the variable called full name, I just use the full name variable here plus something like this on the email. So basically we use this Request.Form for both the text boxes, for the text box full name text box and for the email text box. And then we are putting those values into two variables, one called full name and one called email. And then I just create a string that are sent back to the client, user information equals to the full name and the email address. So let's just run this application and see what's happening. So then I run the application, and the application are now opened in my default web browser. And then you have this name and the email, and now I can type something here and an email, and now when I click OK here, this information should be sent back to the server. And also you can see there is a short blink, meaning that this information or this web page are sent back to the server and then back to the client again. So when I click OK here now, you see it was a blink here, and then you see those are now empty, but in the view data user data here we have user information Hans Petter Halvorsen, which was the name I entered here, and my email address, which I entered here. So basically, by using this Request.Form, we are able to retrieve data from the client to the server like this. So in the next example, we will use something called Request.Query instead, in combination with get and OnGet event handler on the server side. The graphical user interface will be identical. So you'll have these two text boxes, name and email, and then you click OK. Data should be sent back to the server and back to the client, and the data should be presented like in the earlier example here in the bottom. But now we will use Request.Query instead. So let's see how we can do that in Visual Studio. So now we are back in Visual Studio. Let's start on the client side part. So now instead of method equals to post, we use the get method. So method equals to get. So that's the only change we need to do in this page. And then on the server side, instead of using this OnPost, we need to use the OnGet method. Then I just start by just copying this one and then paste it in, and then instead of OnPost I just name it OnGet like this, and then we have the same two variables, but now instead of Request.Form we need to use Request.Query like this, and the same here, and basically that's the all we need to do. So then let's just run this application. And now I can also comment out this one. So I just mark it and then just use this comment out. Now this will be a comment. So you see that this part of the code now will not be executed. So only this OnGet method will be executed, since you know on the client side are using method.get here. So let's just start this application. And then here I can enter the name and the email and then click OK. And then when I click OK, the page and the information will be sent back to the server, and then it will be done. Code will be here, will be executed, and then it will be sent back to the client. So let's just click OK. And then you see it was a short blink, meaning that the web page was sent back to the server and then refreshed and sent back to the client. And then you see the user information here, Hans Petter Halvorsen, which was the information I put here, and the email address was the information I put in this text box. And then now we was using get instead of post, and when using get you see the values are now stored in the query string on top here. That's why we need to use this Request.Query instead of Request.Form. And then you see here is the web page, and then we have a question mark, and then we have full name equals to Hans Petter Halvorsen, which is the information stored here, and this full name is the name of the text box, and then we have the and mark, and then email, which is the name of this text box, equals to Hans Petter Halvorsen at usn.no. So the information that are sent back to the server are stored here in the query string or in the URL like this. So here's a short explanation to this example. So we are using this HTML form element that are used to create a form on the web page, and then the form can have different attributes like method and action. So far we haven't used the action, only the method. In the first example we set the method equal to post, and then we needed to use Request.Form, and in the latest example we set method equal to get, and then we needed to use Request.Query. And if the get verb is used, then the form values are appended to the receiving web page URL as a query string values, as we saw on top in our web browser. And now in the next example we will also use the action attribute, but if this action attribute is not used, then the form will be submitted to the current URL, namely the same page that the form are inside. But now in the next example we will use the action method and then send the data to another web page. So then let's start on this second example, where we also here in this example use Request.Query. So here we have the same web page, this start web page, where we enter the name and the email, and when we click OK, in the previous example we was sent to the same web page, and the value that was entered here and here was put into the query string. it will be in the same way now, but now when we are going to click the OK button, this data should be sent to another web page that we are going to create. So now we have this index web page, and then we have this second web page that I will create, and it will be called view data. And then I will present the data that are written in the first page in the second web page like this. So let's create this application as well. So now we are back in Visual Studio. We have this index page, but let's create another page called view data. So then I just right click here on pages, add, and then I select a new item, and then I select ordinary eraser page, which I find here, eraser page empty, and then here I can name the file, and then I have decided that this file should be called view data like this. Click add, and then this web page will be created here with a client side part and a server side part. So let's go to the client side part, which I have here, and I just copy some code in here. Then I just have a header, and then here I will present the information from the first web page, this index page. So then I have this view data, user data. So that's basically the client side part. Let's open the server side part as well, this view data dot cs html dot cs. So basically here I will use the same code as in index.cs html.cs. So I just open this one and just copy this OnGet method, and then put it in this second web page called viewData.cs html.cs. So basically that's all we need to do in this page. But in the start page, this index page, here we need to, here we have this method equals to get, but then we also need to add this action. So then we type action equals to, and then here we just enter the name of this second web page, which is view data like this. So basically that should be all. Then let's just run the application. So the index page is the same. We can enter a name and an email, and then we click OK. And now when we click OK, the data should be sent to a second web page called view data. So then just click OK here now, and then you see the new web page called view data was opening, and then the information that was written in the first web page are now sent to this second web page. And then you see also here, since we are using the get method, the data are now added to the URL. So then we have view data question mark full name equals to Hans Petter Halvorsen, which is this one, the first text box, and then and then email equals to hans.p.halvorsen@usl.no, which is the information now presented here, and that is the information from the second text box called email. So basically this is how this form are working. Either we can use method equal get or method equal post, and then we can have an action if you want to send the data to another web page. And then on the server side part, we are either using OnGet if the method are get, or OnPost if the method are post. So let's go further with the next example. In example 3, we will use an alternative approach. So we will not use Request.Form or Request.Query. those can of course be used, and also those are the same way that are used in other programming frameworks like PHP, etc. In order to get user data from the client side to the server side in ASP.NET. But now we will use an alternative approach, which is included or part of the ASP.NET Core framework. So the example or the application will be the same. So you'll have the same index web page where you have two text boxes, one for name and one for email, and then this information will be sent back to the server for processing and then sent back to the client and presented here in the bottom. And now we are back in Visual Studio and in the index.cs HTML file, and now we will use the post method, and then we will send the data to the same web page. So the action property is not needed. So then basically we have this web page that we started with, where we have a form with two text boxes, one called full name and another one for email. And then we have the method equal to post, and then in the server side part we need to use the OnPost method. So then I just remove these comments like this. So now instead of using Request.Form, we will use the built-in data binding in ASP.NET Core. So then we can just remove those. And then in this OnPost method we can have input arguments. So then I just put these two variables as input arguments. Like this, and then I can remove these two variables and then end up with just one line of code inside the OnPost method, like this. So now here I have the OnPost method, which is handling the feedback or the redirect back to the server from the client. And now since I'm now using this built-in feature in ASP.NET, I can just specify the variables here in the same order as they are presented here in the form. Namely, this first text box is the full name, and the second text box is the email, and then I just specify two variables for that, one for the full name, and both are of type string. So then string full name, comma, string email, and then I can use those variables inside my C# code. So basically, now the code will be a bit simpler, and you don't need to use Request.Form or Request.Query. You just put the values that we want to receive from the client as input arguments in the OnPost method like this. So let's just run this application, and then we should hopefully see the same behavior. But now we have used this built-in data binding feature in ASP.NET, as you see here. So then I just type a name and an email address, and then I click OK, and the data was sent back to the server and then back to the client, and then it was presented here in the bottom. And then as you see, we get the same results as earlier. But now we have used this built-in data binding feature in ASP.NET Core. I will also present some alternative approaches. So in the next example, 3b, I will use something called a BindProperty. So let's go back to Visual Studio and see how we can use that. So now instead of having the full name and the email as input arguments on the OnPost method, I will create properties, class properties for those two. So let's create some properties for those. Then I just, on top here, I'm having these two variables here instead. I remove them from this OnPost method, and then we need to name them public, since this should be properties. So public string full name, and then we need to use this get set in order to make it a property. Just copy it and use the same for this one, public string email, and this get set property to make it those two as properties like this. And then also, in order to make this data binding happening, I need to set this property called bind property like this for both these two class properties like this. So basically that's the change we need to do. So now, instead of having the variable full name and email as input arguments here in the OnPost method, I have created two properties inside the class, one called full name and one called email. And then in addition, we need to set this bind property for both of them like this. So then let's just run this application, and the behavior should be the same, but we have just done it in a different way. Then I just type the name here and the email and click OK, and then you see we get the same behavior. The name and the email are presented here in the bottom. So this is make sure that this information are presented in the bottom of the web page, and then by using this bind property and create two properties inside this page model class, and also use those properties inside the OnPost method, we are able to handle and data bind the values that are sent from the client to the server. I will also show another alternative. So instead of using a bind property, we can use something called BindProperties. So let's see how we can use the bind properties in our application. So this alternative example is almost identical. So instead of now using bind property, we just use the bind properties on the entire class, and then I can just remove a bind property for these two properties like this. So basically it's almost identical, but now instead of setting bind property for each of the properties, assuming we have lots of properties, then we can set it for the entire class like this, and then the behavior will be identical. So let's just run the application and just verify that we get the same result. So now instead of bind property for each of the property, we set or use the bind properties for the entire class, making all the properties we have here part of the data binding. So then we have our name and our email, and click OK, and then you see the name are presented and the email are presented here in the bottom. So now we have different options that we can use in order to send data from the client to the server. We can use Request.Form, we can use Request.Query, and we can use the built-in data binding feature in ASP.NET Core, where you can use either bind properties or bind property for each of the properties, or we can have input arguments here on the either on the OnPost method or on the OnGet method. I will show one final alternative solution. And now we have shown that we can send data from the client to the server on individual variables and the text boxes, but we can also create and use classes. So let's see how we can do that. So this alternative approach may be good to use if you have many text boxes or information that should be sent from the client to the server. And then it's good to create and use a class instead. So then just let's create a class here in the bottom. Sorry, it has to be, of course, outside this class, so we have to put it here. Then I just create a public class, public class, and then I can just call it person, like this, and then we can create those properties here. So I just copy them from here, put them into the class like this. And then we have two. This class is very basic. So name is person. That's the name of the class, and then it has two properties, namely full name and email, like this. And then instead of using the full name and the email here, you can just use person dot full name, and then person dot email, like this. But first we need to define this an object of this this class here. So then we have just type public public, and the name of the class person, and the name of the object person, and then we also need to use this get sets here. So then we just create a public property here called person, and then of course, since we are going to use this built-in data binding feature, we need to specify that this should be of type bind property, like this. So basically that's all you need. So it's almost identical as previous examples, but now we are assuming we have we still have the same two text boxes, full name and email, but assuming you have lots of text boxes, then it may be a better solution to create a class like this. So then we can create a class called person or whatever, where we specify these properties, namely full name, email, and if we had lots of others, we could just add those inside this class. And then we need to specify bind property here, and then we can use those properties inside this OnPost method. So let's just run this example, and it will of course work in the same manner as the previous example, but we have just now unstructured the code and using a class instead. So then we just type name and email here and click OK, and then you see in the bottom we still get the same information. But now we have used and created a class here, and we have used the bind property to create an object of that class, and then we are using that object inside the OnPost method, person.fullname and person.email, like this. So let's summarize this tutorial. So in this tutorial we have seen how we can get user data from the client side to the server side using ASP.NET Core. We started with the traditional way, which are used in many other web programming frameworks like PHP, etc. And those methods are also working in ASP.NET Core, so you can still use those methods. And those methods are Request.Form and Request.Query. But we can also use an alternative solution, namely the data binding approach, which is part of the ASP.NET framework. Here are some of the resources I have used in this tutorial. So that's all. So good luck with ASP.NET Core. Thank you.